we are happy to welcome Al Rapaport, our friend from Open Mind Zen. And we're going to talk about working on our hot button topics today, reducing stress and anxiety through inner dialogue.
So the topic this morning is, I think, one that virtually everyone can identify with. Some of you know me since I've been here a number of times in the past before. I am the leader of Open Mind Zen International, which is a group of Zen meditation centers. We have groups in Europe and various parts of Florida and other areas of the U.S. And what I'll be speaking about this morning is kind of a side path that I've been on for many years now. It relates to Zen practice. Zen is a meditation practice, but it's what I call Zen dialogue. And Zen dialogue is a form of what's called parts work. Those of you who may be psychotherapists or have trained in psychotherapy or had psychotherapy at all may be familiar with parts work. And the notion of parts work is that our inner landscape, so to speak, or the way we might identify ourselves, rather than it being a monolithic creature, or being is probably a better word, is actually a society, a society of different selves. And depending on which self or selves that we're operating from, our experience in our life varies tremendously. So the work that I do with individuals and groups these days is almost all oriented towards this kind of notion that by getting in touch with the parts of ourself which we're not already conscious of and what their agendas are and why we're engaging in the way we are in our relationships with others, influences how our internal experience of life is, and conversely, how others experience us and how they feel being around us. In addition to whether are we creating more suffering around us, or whether we're creating more joy, more awakening, more understanding. So when I do this kind of talk, I prefer to interact one-on-one with different audience members, but I'll just say a little bit to kind of get things started and then see what questions you might have or what issues that we might be able to, I can show you how this process works easier in real time. So the notion of Zen dialogue, as I said before, is that we are kind of like a society at large. Within our society in this country and in the world, there's many, probably virtually an infinite number of different perspectives. People believe different things, they view themselves and the world and others in different ways, and those viewpoints are influenced by culture, by family life, by each individual's individual journey, but the culture at large is full of all kinds of different elements, you might say. Some would agree with your opinions and viewpoints and say life goals, and others that might have what seem to be opposite goals or opposite perspectives. We encounter this in our political system, for instance. We also encounter it in relationships. We encounter it in every aspect of our life, that when we go out into the world at large, what we find is people that are not the same way we are in some form or another, sometimes in major ways. So the notion of parts work is that that also exists within ourself. And it's one of the reasons why many times, and we probably all know someone like this, or maybe we've been this person. I know that I can say from both perspectives, I've both been this person and also know people that are this person. And that is the person that appears to be a certain way, and they're acting a certain way, and we, even though we get to know this person pretty well, all of a sudden something happens that seems to be entirely out of character, and you wonder, how could that person have done that? How could that person think that when I thought I knew them? In fact, I did know them for a week or 20 years. So the notion of parts work is a great way of getting in touch with why that can be the case, because someone can also all of a sudden be triggered by something in their life and go in a very different direction than you may have experienced them before. Or, speaking for myself, that I also can experience that I can have certain life goals and certain ways that I want to be in this world, and yet if I'm triggered in an intense enough way, that can flip and then go into an arena that I don't really want to be moving into. So the whole notion of this type of work is that we need to first get in touch with the parts that are not skillfully adapting or skillfully performing in a way that we want them to be. Excuse me. And the way we do that is first by doing what the song we were singing right before I gave my talk about being still. So first we need to experience some stillness. We have to be able, whatever method we use, whether it's meditation, whether it's contemplation, whether it's walking the dog, whatever we do to kind of help clear things out a little bit, that once we start to get a little more clear and there's not so much noise going on, then we can turn our attention towards these stresses and anxieties that inevitably everyone has in life. And number one, start to see that we are responsible for how we react. And this is really important, because the alternative to that is blaming others and blaming situations for our experiences of stress or anxiety. So the minute we begin to take responsibility, that's when we can begin to look at what might I be doing, what perspective or what part of myself, what reactivity that may have existed within my mind for many years, sometimes going back to the early childhood days. What part of me is being reactive, is being triggered by what that person says or does, or what situation I find myself in. And Hal Stone, who developed the voice dialogue technique, called these disowned parts and primary parts. So disowned parts of the self are parts that are essentially unconscious, and I prefer using the word unconscious or subconscious, depending on whether we know a little bit or virtually nothing about that part. And a primary part would be a part that we're quite conscious of. In other words, if someone says, "Oh, Al's quite talkative," I kind of know that I'm a quite talkative person at least some of the time, and so that would be a primary part I'd be aware of. But there may be a part or many parts that I'm not aware of. And the minute that we can then turn an unconscious part of ourself to a conscious part, then the hold that part has over us, the unconscious behavior pattern, can be transformed. So consciousness transforms that which we're not aware of into what we're aware of. The second we become aware of something that's no longer unconscious, at least that part of it that we see. Sometimes we need to follow a thread back and become more aware. So now the way that I teach, and it's a little hard to do in this short of a talk, but the way that I teach to get in touch with this is by going through the body itself, going through the somatic aspect of a thing. So in other words, if we're feeling anxious, the very word anxiety is not anxiety is not a thing, it's a description of something going on. So it's a descriptor. Accompanying anxiety is always a somatic aspect. The somatic aspect is, what I mean by that is how it feels within the body. So how does that anxiety we're experiencing feel? And when I'm doing this process with people, a lot of times I'll say, well, how does that feel in the body? And they'll go into something that is not a feeling in the body because a lot of times we want to avoid feeling. So ultimately, this process is all about allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling and getting in touch with what am I feeling when anxiety or stress, which is what we're talking about today. Could be anything, but anxiety and stress arise. Stress is another word, but it's a concept. It's not a thing. Now, everyone thinks they know what stress is, but what you might feel when you're stressed could be very different from what Larry or myself feel when we're stressed. So the word is a descriptor of something that we're feeling. And the most direct path that I've found to work with this kind of material is to get in touch with how it feels. So this takes some focus, and not everyone is willing to put the energy into this that's necessary, but this is where it helps to have a contemplative or meditative practice. So if we're feeling a particular anxiety, especially if it's a chronic thing, now everyone has temporary anxieties, like someone cuts in front of you in traffic and all of a sudden you get that rush of, I could have been killed or whatever. It creates a kind of anxiety. That's one form. But then once we get over that, it generally passes. So this is more about chronic things that we find arising a lot, stress or anxiety. And seeing how through allowing ourselves to feel the actual somatic sensation, the physical sensation of how that, let's take anxiety for instance, like say we're feeling anxious about something and we find that it's a often recurring theme. Sometimes it may be in response to certain kinds of things, and we may not know why. Why do I feel so anxious when I experience this thing or that thing, and Joe or Cindy on the left or right of me does not, perhaps? Well, generally speaking, it's because something in our past, it's evoking something that happened in our past which was traumatic or anxiety-producing, often from our childhood. And so it's very important to begin to get in touch with what those things are. I don't know how familiar you all are with Gabor Mate. Has anyone read any or is familiar with Gabor Mate? Well, Gabor Mate has written a number of books on what the effects of early childhood trauma are on the health, the mental and physical health later in life. And if you've never listened to any of his stuff, I recommend. He's on Spotify. He also has a number of best-selling books, Gabor Mate. He worked in he was a physician who worked with children, and he started seeing very common themes in children, the way they acted. And he kind of developed these theories, which they're not alien to other forms of psychology, but he kind of clarified a lot more how important it is as parents, for instance, that we raise children in a way in which they're not traumatized all the time. However, most of us didn't have parents that were that conscious of that, especially my generation. There was zero consciousness of that, at least the people I knew. It's not that my parents were bad parents, don't get me wrong. I think I had better parents than some. But there was no consciousness that by treating a child a certain way, that there could be something that would be created within that child, a reactivity that would then arise when that person was 20, 30, 40, 50, or in my case, over 70. But it is the case. It can happen. It does happen. So in order to understand these triggers, we have to really get in touch with the feeling, the way it feels right now, allow ourselves to really go into it, and then to let that feeling kind of reveal to us the genesis of how it developed in our life. And often when we do this, and it's fascinating how easily we can have access to early memory sometimes when we use this technique. We will go back to an event that happened when we were 3 or 4 or 5 or 7. I've worked with thousands of people with this technique, and people that had never done this kind of work before were able, through a technique like this, to get in touch with what it was, what decisions were made early on, what reactivity was experienced early on as a result of a child's way of viewing how to deal with things. Now, children have very few options in how to deal with things compared to adults. For instance, a lot of times we can just walk out or do something else or get in a different relationship or leave the country or whatever. Children can't do that. They basically are trapped where they are. So the way children deal with stresses like that is they basically disassociate from whatever's happening. This kind of disassociation from feeling is an epidemic in modern culture. There's a disassociation from how we actually feel. And feeling is the key to empathy, to compassion, to, to joy in life. So I could get more into this, but I think it'd be, like I said, it's kind of nice, and I've always enjoyed with this group doing a little back and forth. Does anyone have any questions about what I've said so far, or any clarification? It's my favorite way of working. Yes, we avoid, when something's uncomfortable, we avoid it. It's, even ants, if you try and kill an ant, will either flee or fight or flight. It'll try and bite you if it can't run away, and that's all animals do this. So we have a deeply ingrained from the earliest parts of our evolution that fight or flight syndrome. And the fight or flight syndrome is quite valuable when we're actually fleeing from something that's trying to kill us. So ancient humans had to flee from cave bears, saber-toothed tigers, all kinds of other animals that could kill them. And you need that adrenaline in order to run faster or be stronger. The problem is, in modern life, most of our attackers are our own psychological states of mind. So what happens is we end up turning that energy back on ourselves. And all those stress hormones, which are extremely useful if we're trying to run away from a cave bear, which we probably wouldn't be able to do, actually. They were pretty fast from what I was just reading. But you could try, and you would try if you had to. But when we turn that energy inward and don't process it out in a healthy way, then it becomes very corrosive to our being, to our life. As a result of that fight or flight issue, we are very reluctant often as humans to be disturbed. We don't like disturbance. And the thing is, we have to be willing to do the process I'm describing. We have to be willing to be disturbed for a while. We have to be willing to go into the pain or the disturbance within us from the past trauma in one form or another. This method I'm talking about is a specific method which is oriented towards seeing each thing that comes up as an expression of a part of ourself, and not pushing it away, not trying to get rid of it, but rather understanding why it's there. There's a valid reason why our stresses and anxieties are there. It's just that they were valid 50 years ago or 30 years ago. They're not necessarily valid to an adult living now. And so when we're bringing childhood ways of coping into an adult life, then we end up with, acting like a lot of politicians. Sorry. But one thing that Gabor Mate says is every child grows up in a different family. And I never thought about that much. But in my own family, I'm the oldest of 4, and there's a 10-year range. My youngest brother was born when I was 10. So he really did grow up in a different family from his description. When he describes his experience of growing up in the family, I can't even relate to it because I was already gone at that point. I was out of the house at an early age. So. Yeah, it's the same in a way, but it's really not because of what you said. Each person is different. The way each person processes change, processes trauma, processes just simple everyday things. There are things that, for instance, a highly sensitive person will experience trauma from sometimes things that someone that's not so sensitive won't think it's a big deal. And you hear it all the time, oh, that's not a big deal. Why are you so this way or that way about it? Well, for a highly sensitive person, for whatever the reason that their sensitivity is so high, they just don't experience it the same way, and a lot of times we forget that, and we don't have compassion sometimes for people who are experiencing things in very different ways than we are, because to us it's like, well, why should that bother you? Well, it does, and that should be enough that it does, especially if you love that person. You know, if something is bothering them, then I feel we need to work with what's bothering them, not try and apply a general standard to their experience. Yeah, again, these are all, these are things we're often not conscious of. So it's really important to be aware of this kind of thing, number one. But number two, then how do we work with our own material in this regard? And again, when we can view ourselves as a collection of different voices rather than a monolithic self, then we can really see things in a very nuanced way and work with different aspects of ourselves in a really nuanced way, and with others too. Because if someone's acting out in a certain way, we can see, well, that's not the sum total of who they are, perhaps. It's just that part is being triggered. Why is that part being triggered? Well, maybe they're a highly sensitive person. We have to work with them in a very different way because they are so highly sensitive, rather than just, again, saying, oh, you're just, everything bothers you, you know. So people have different levels of sensitivity. Say that if any of you want more information on what I do, you can go to openmindzen.com, and there's a lot of information there about the work that I do.